Welcome to the Max Out Mindset Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Larry Whitman, sometimes known as Doc in the Mindset World. I say I do this podcast because I've been blessed over the last 20 years or so to work with some of the best teams, leaders, athletes, and coaches. So I like to share what I've learned from them. And when I get a chance to have a guest on, certainly learn from them as well. I say my definition of maxing out is given the talent, the depth, the experience of the athletes and coaches, the health and the intangibles. Can a team reach the limits of their capabilities? And then can they do it under pressure when it matters? Because I always say, if you can't do it when it matters, what's the point? So, of course, I mentioned when I'm lucky enough to have a guest on, I certainly want to spend most of our time learning from our guests. The guest I have today wears a lot of hats that have required being a high performer in many endeavors and being highly successful at it. Take away the family kind of piece and friend piece of his life. He's the host of one of the most popular sports shows in the Midwest. He was a former high-level Division I athlete, had a little pro experience as well. He is a coach. He also is a parent of a high-level athlete getting ready to navigate that world. So today I'm really, really, really lucky to have on my show Coach Damon Benning. Welcome to the Max Out Mindset Podcast.
Hey, Doc, I really appreciate it. I've been a fan from afar, and over the last 15 months, man, really enjoyed getting a chance to pick your brain and buddy up close to you. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on today. We've crossed paths through different means. And then, of course, my alma mater is Westside High School. I've helped their football team out at some capacity for the past few years. And then, lo and behold, you become an assistant coach at Westside in a long path of highly successful coaching stops for you. And obviously, you have a son, Caleb, who plays on the team as well, who I've gotten to know. So, Mike, first question for you is, you heard me talk about the definition of maxing out for me. When you think about max out, what's your definition?
Well, for me, and I used to use this, right? I've used it in a couple of different coaching stops, and for me, it means to be the epitome of your God-given talents, right? It's almost the maximization is, am I the best version of myself? And I try to keep it simple, right? I'm usually around young people, and I try not to get too convoluted with big words or anything. And am I simply the best version of myself? I think it's an easy reminder to check yourself. It's not about anybody else's barometer. It's not about their expectations. It's, am I leaving anything on the table? Sometimes it's in day-to-day decision making. Sometimes it's in the weight room. Sometimes it's in the classroom. Is there more in me? And if there is, why haven't I given it? And if there isn't, have I truly maxed out? And I just think it's simple, I should say, but it's not easy. The concept, when you say the words, it's like, hey, am I the best version of myself? But the practical application of it is as you know, it is not always easy to accomplish.
Yeah, I love that. And really what he's talking about is commitment, about being that all-in mentality. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we're not. Sometimes, one, we don't know what it takes to be all in, especially as we transition into different levels. And sometimes we just have life get in the way that prevents us from being all in, even though we say we're going to be, or we've lost the role we've had, and now we're sulking and frustrated, and we quit doing some of the things that we did. And so one of the things I want to talk to you about quite a bit here in just a bit is transitions, because I want to have you take me back a little bit for, while you are obviously well known to lots of people between your playing days at Nebraska, your Sharp and Benning sports talk radio show that's been so popular, your role as a coach all over Omaha, and an analyst and on TV as well for the Big Ten Network and for NPR, or not NPR, but Nebraska
Public Relations. Yeah.
Nebraska Public Relations. You're on in a lot of different places, so most people know you. But for those who don't know your backstory as well, could you just fill me in a little bit, or share with us a little bit about your background and growing up as a young person up to the time I would say you got to the University of Nebraska.
Yeah, there's a lot, but in its simplest form, I'm the youngest of five. My dad was my best friend. My mom is probably closer to my backbone. So I was fortunate in terms of kind of the structure in our household where my mom worked her tail off as a stay-at-home mom, kind of modeled household order. And my dad, who coached at the University of Omaha, he was a national championship winning coach for the wrestling team. He was moved on to be in an administrative role in Omaha Public Schools, and then became assistant superintendent. And so, kind of setting the stage for a backdrop where the home was extremely important, family was important, and education was important. So growing up, I had my ups and downs. My sisters are extremely bright. My brother is in the middle of the pack, and was a high achiever as well. And so, as one of those guys, Doc, that got to see everything come before me, I made these decisions to either sometimes swim upstream or go with the flow. And I think for me, it was critical. I was a smaller kid growing up, was a pretty good athlete, was a better baseball player, than I'd say a football player. And in growing up, things kind of came easy to me in terms of education. And so, as you'll probably glean through this interview, my mind pings all over the place, and focus and concentration wasn't always the most important thing to me. I was kind of a bottom line guy that used the end to justify the means, right? If I get good grades, how does it matter how I get there, and things like that. And so I don't think there wasn't a year, Doc, until I was probably a freshman where a teacher didn't call home in some capacity. Whether it was me being stubborn, or, swimming upstream, or, kind of giving some sarcastic comment, because growing up, it was difficult. I think being the son, being a Benning, I think carrying that name, I wasn't mature enough to look at it as a badge of honor. It was always something that I kind of fought against. I wanted to be different. I never understood why I would be in class, and sometimes something would happen, and my teachers would say, "Hey, does your father know that you're acting like this?" And in my head, and unfortunately sometimes I would say it, I said, he'd be pretty disappointed if he knew you were using him as the gauge, as opposed to kind of handling it yourself, right? And that never endeared itself well to teachers. And so, inevitably there would be these calls home, but I would flourish as a student. And so I could buy myself some time, right, with skirting the issues in terms of a good core strong behavior. And it's funny when we lived, obviously as an African American, and we lived off of 99th and Fort, and we had moved from 40th and Bedford, and so to my friends that looked like me, Doc, I lived way out there. And it was a tough transition for me. I think from an identity standpoint, and being secure with who I was, that I was affectionately dubbed, we were the Huxtables, right? And that was something that was never comfortable for me, because I didn't quite know where I fit, right? I was too black for some, and not black enough for others. And for me, it was tough. My siblings, 4 of the 5 went to Central. My dad was an administrator previously, and of course I decided I wanted to go to Northwest, right? It was different. I was a baseball guy. I wanted to play baseball before I played football, and Coach Olson was somebody that I wanted to go play for. And that was the first tough decision. And so I just think kind of balancing the power in a name, which I've now grown to embrace, right? I teach it to my kids all the time about legacy, and what will people say about you when you're no longer here. All those transitions happened slowly. I was a senior in high school and had just accepted an offer to go play football at the University of Nebraska, but I knew I was a baseball player at heart. And coming out of high school, Doc, I'd had a good baseball career and was drafted right out of high school. Now it was late; it was 36th round, or I think the Pirates, and it was a conversation that I posed to my dad about wanting to go play baseball, and he wanted me to go get my education and wanted me to honor my scholarship, and that was tough. It was very difficult because I didn't feel like that was a decision in which I had any ownership in. And it's on the heels of I played, if I back up just a smidge, maybe a semester, I was a quarterback my whole life. And my coaches had come to me my junior year and said, "Hey, instead of you giving the ball away, why don't we give you the ball?" I'd never played running back, for 15 years. And I didn't want to do that either. And obviously it turned out well in hindsight, but that was kind of my dad's decision. He was like, I took it home to him, and he talked to me about being others centered and doing things for the greater good. And these are terms that I know, but I don't really understand, especially the practical application of it. And I'm like, what is he talking? Like, this is about me. This is my decision. What is this about being others centered? And so it didn't really sit well. And that senior year was kind of an internal battle for me. The grades were good, senior class president was good, but the internal struggle of identity was an issue. And I begrudgingly didn't pursue the baseball thing coming out of high school, because when I went back to talk to Coach Osborne, and he can tell you this story, the goal was to play both sports at Nebraska. I didn't really realize later on the dynamics between then Coach Sanders and Coach Osborne, and the baseball football thing wasn't always kosher, and how important spring ball was in football when baseball was played. And I missed the first year because I was competing for a starting job, and the second spring rolls around and Calvin Jones just leaves to go to the NFL, and all of a sudden I'm thrust into a spot where I'm competing for a starting job in the running back room. And I remember Coach Osborne coming to me and telling me how important spring was. And again, it was another one of those decisions I think I did for somebody else and not myself. And now it's compounded, right? You high school, I didn't feel like I had enough say so in that deal. In college, it's still working out. And Doc, I got to tell you, I struggled. My first year and a half, I'd broken the record for freshman performance index. I thought I should be playing right away. I didn't redshirt until the fourth game when we traveled to Washington, and I'd never sat out before. It made it easy to look back and think, well, why aren't I playing baseball if I'm sitting anyway? And my grades suffered, right? I was a 1.7 GPA after my first semester. I remember Dennis LeBlanc, who was my academic advisor at the time, telling me I was perhaps the greatest underachiever he had ever seen. And that stuck with me. To this day, I remind him that he told me that, because as will probably come out in this till, I'm ultra competitive. And, him telling me that was kind of the start of something good. And so I never really settled in. It sounds strange, I know, and I usually don't talk about this a ton out loud, but it sounds strange for somebody that comes across with having so much confidence and conviction that, for my first, I'd say 25, 30 years, I had to really settle in kind of and become comfortable with who I was and my own skin, and stop spending a lot less time trying to be other things to other people. And it started kind of as a young guy, which coincidentally enough, Doc, is one of the reasons why I love investing in young people, because I think the security and the belief in self and understanding value is so important to me because I didn't get it until later in life. And I learned some painful lessons. I wasted the first couple of years of my playing career at Nebraska, even though I played early. I struggled in my first marriage, from an identity crisis, too much too soon, trying to be all things to other people. And so it's just become a mission the last 15, 16 years, to truly try to be something different and invest in the lives of young people.
Yeah. So now I think my audience can now see why I was so intrigued and interested in having you
I don't
on
know
the
about
show,
that.
because my experience in spending time listening to you, at Westside, but even more so a lot of times on your show,
Mhm.
was your ability to articulate this combination of confidence, but also fragility, like
Yeah.
vulnerability. And to be able to say, because you could have shaped that story any way you wanted just now about your career, and could have been done in Nebraska going, I was a star D1 athlete, and everything went my way. And yet there are a lot of struggles along the way. And I think it actually gives a lot of kids today hope in a way that they're not alone when they're in struggle, because so many of them think that people like you, who they look at as being successful, played at the highest level, all the top shows, great coach, that we don't have struggles. Like, we're
Yeah.
kind of the lucky ones. We've just always figured it out. And yet life really has been a constant string of struggles at different times, of you figuring out identity at some points, trying to separate from people that were really important to you, from what I hear, and making your own decisions. Because I don't know for sure, but maybe you can comment on this, what your ultimate relationship was with Coach Osborne, because you've already mentioned dad was your best friend. And I know just from reading and hearing you talk about that relationship was a pretty powerful one,
Yeah.
that not everyone has with their father. And but then another powerful man in your life, Coach Osborne, and there's a common theme early on, that they were able to have you do some things that necessarily you hadn't squared with just completely. Like, it wasn't your full decision, even though you made the decision. What ended up, talk to me a little bit about Coach Osborne before I go back to your dad for a minute.
Okay.
How did that relationship evolve, and where did it ultimately go?
Yeah. Very, very slow. Um, it's funny you bring that up, and you're you're so smart. One of the reasons it took me so long to say yes, I was like, oh my gosh, this guy may open me up here pretty good. So there may be some times I have to pause and kind of get my emotions in check. The, the growth and the maturation and the respect, the reverence that I have for Coach Osborne definitely took time. Early on, I struggled, and he wasn't necessarily somebody that I would say our personalities meshed with. I was a little more linear. He's a lot more philosophical. And so for me, I'm about the practical application. Okay, well, how does this work for me? And he was a guy that was, there's a lot of greater good in seeing the bigger picture. And when you're 18 and 19 or 20 or 21, those appear to be abstract concepts, right? I just didn't get it. And I remember one time, Doc, I was with my roommate, and we were moving, and he and I had gotten into a fight. We were moving off out of the dorms into an apartment, and he and I got into an altercation, about where we were living. And as we were packing, and campus police come, and they break it up, and we didn't let them in right away. And I'm still arguing with my roommate because of course I wanted to be right. There's a lot of my personality in that. And the campus police comes through the door in the dorms, and I'm in essence throwing a bag of candy. There are these two great big Halloween bags of candy, and I throw them back at my roommate, and who was Troy Dumas at the time. And one of them hits the officer, and they immediately wrestle me, to the ground. And I'm of course saying, hey, it wasn't intentional, whatever I was saying. I was just probably just being immature, right? And I ended up being arrested. But my roommate and I had fought, so I was bleeding. I was cut. And so just imagine the police officers, they have to take me to get stitched up. I'm explaining my case because, of course, I feel like I'm in the right. It happened over the weekend. And if it's assault of a police officer, technically you're not supposed to get out over the weekend on a felony. So I get out on Sunday night. I have to have this long talk with Coach Osborne. My parents come to get me. The first person to come visit me in the morning, that Saturday morning, was my roommate, Troy Dumas, who was in my wedding. He's clearly one of my best friends. And I just remember Coach Osborne kind of lecturing me about decision-making and being a representative of Nebraska and this whole greater good philosophy. All the while, Doc, I just wanted him to hear my story, right? I'm like, wait a minute, like this was just between us. Nobody invited them in. It didn't have to be like, and all the things that you can imagine somebody is trying to rationalize. And I could tell he was disappointed. And there's this level of hurt. I'm the youngest of 5. I'm way more sensitive than I should be. I blame it on my birth sign. I'm a Pisces. And I'm kind of a baby. So I kind of held that against him. I didn't feel like he understood. I think he kind of talked over me. That was coupled by another incident about 8 months later where I was arrested the night before Lawrence Phillips ended up getting in trouble. And it turns out my neighbors had seen the whole thing. They vouched for me. I tried to tell Coach Osborne what happened, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to support you. But I'm just telling you, if you're not telling me the truth, you're gone." Now, keep in mind, I'm a redshirt freshman, and I'm already under a great deal of stress. And I remember I didn't look at it as him believing in me like he really was. I looked at it as him giving me an ultimatum. And that wasn't something that I responded to. And so even early on in my career, as I'm contributing and I'm playing, I almost did it in a vindictive manner to say, hey, listen, I told you, right? I still didn't kind of get this greater good thing. And I remember, my redshirt sophomore season, meeting a gentleman by the name of Chris Bubach, who was the FCA director. And Chris would talk to everybody but me, it seemed. That's the way I'm retelling the story, because revisionist history would tell you different. But there's something about this guy. He's talking to all these people and he has this glow, and why won't he talk to me? And so I just asked him one day, and I'm like this, like, you'll get this from me, where if I want to know, I'm just going to ask him. And I said, hey, what is it about all these other guys? Why haven't we met? And so we sit down, and short story long, he's talking about other relationships, spiritual relationships that are important, and where my focus is, and just trying to pour into me as from a holistic approach. And my prism started to change. And things that other people have been saying to me the last, I'm 19 at 20 at the time. So let's say realistically 16 years. I won't count from 4 under. Started to make a little more sense. This whole other centered concept, greater than me, purpose. And I started to look at Coach Osborne differently. And I didn't look at him as this big bad ogre in the sky that I didn't want to confide in. I didn't try to pit he and Coach Solich against each other, which I often tried to do. I would tell myself, well, Coach Solich, he wants me to play. I'm a Coach Solich guy, but Coach Osborne has the ultimate trump card. So, it's us versus Coach Osborne, right? The things that you tell yourself. And as I started to grow and mature, our relationship changed dramatically. And people talk about my career accomplishments, and whether it's the Orange Bowl MVP or 2 national championships. And I'll tell you, sure as I'm sitting here, Doc, I don't even know if I've ever said this out loud. The greatest accomplishment for me during my time at Nebraska, given how my first 2.5 years were started, was being voted a captain my senior year, which If you would have asked me, I was never our best player. I was a good player, but never our best. Never a full-time starter. For me, how my peers thought about me and what I deemed as the coaches allowing me to assume that mantle started kind of the upward ascent. Now, my foundation wasn't firm yet, right? If you think like scrambled eggs, they're still a little runny, but at least I know that I think my life going forward is going to be scrambled eggs, right? Like it's just starting to take shape. And I attribute a lot of that growth and development to Coach Osborne staying with me. He's now become a guy, we did, when my teammate passed away, Lawrence Phillips, I did a GoFundMe account and Nebraska fans rallied and we raised like $26,000 for the funeral. And I remember calling Coach Osborne and getting his guidance and tutelage. Hey, if I do this, how should I do this? And who do I call next? And what are the next steps? And how do I deal with this? Or I can call him on his birthday and say, hey, happy birthday. Or I can be a part of some advisory panels that he's asked me about, or, when he reaches out to say, hey, can you help me with that relationship has really become one over time that I have appreciated a lot more and has a significant amount of value to me. But I would be lying to you. It'd be pretty disingenuous if I told you it was always rainbows and butterflies. I mean, he's kicked me out of practice. He's made me change my shoes. I lied to him about having all the pads in my pants, things that I thought were petty at the time that he looked at as discipline and integrity. I just hadn't developed the capacity to be all on board with.
Yeah. So let me ask you a couple follow-ups to that. What do you think your teammates saw in you that may even surprise you that created a captainship for you? What were they observing behavior-wise in you? As you said, you weren't fully formed scrambled eggs yet. That told them that you deserve to be a captain for them the senior year.
Probably a couple of things. Number one, I'm extremely competitive, and if it's workouts or drills or throwing stuff in the trash can or even being a good student, there's this thing about me where I want to bring other people with me. And I've never been afraid. I don't know where this came from, Doc, but I'm one of those people. If you spend 15 minutes with me, I want to be around as many like-minded, smart people as I can. There's always this conflict in my head sometimes of whether it's okay to be the smartest guy in the room, how to embrace if I am, but then really never wanting to be the smartest guy in the room because there's always people that I want to learn from. I want to spend as much time around other people as I can. But the real conflict is, and get this, Doc, some of it is because I'm selfish, right? I want to be able to glean some other things from other people that have made them successful so I can be successful too, right? It's like, I've never been afraid to hire people or want people around me that are smarter than me because there's always something that I'm going to get from it. I've just started in the last 8-9 years to learn to be comfortable with being a guy that people can glean things from and want to be around, because it took me a long time to feel worthy, to feel like some of the poor decisions I've made in the past, whether it be going through my divorce or what have you, where I felt worthy. And I go back, you asked about my relationship with Coach Osborne, and I remember he told me something. It's tough, right? Just the practical application of it. And he told me, he said, sometimes he sat me down and he was kind of being sarcastic. So I don't know. I didn't really take it serious at the time, but I kind of knew what he meant. And he says, nobody is as, he said, contrary to your belief, Damon, nobody is as against you as you are. And, I thought he was kind of being flippant and, a little passive aggressive. But when he landed the plane, he said, sometimes you need to convince yourself that, number one, it's okay to not be okay. And it's also okay to forgive yourself for not being okay. Didn't really gather what that meant until later on in life, where you start to beat yourself up over some things that you'd like to go get back and maybe change. And you ask yourself, well, what if I would have done something different? Where I finally learned, the thing that you have the most control over is arguably the hardest thing to do. And that's sometimes to forgive yourself. And no real growth starts to happen until you do forgive yourself. And so, unfortunately, that wasn't a lesson until I learned a little bit later in life.
Yeah, but boy, what a great message for people, though, isn't it? That notion that you have to be okay with not being okay sometimes, but
Yeah.
even more important, it's okay to forgive yourself, right? That we're human. And of course, when you're in that age range, 15 to 22, it's just too hard to think that way. And because we're more self-centered and we think we got the world by the tail and we're always right, it's really hard to go to that level. But to be able to take messages he gave you then and use them later on when they were more useful to your concepts and understanding is what a blessing that was for you to be able to take with you there. And there was a lot of emotion attached to that, which is really cool, because that's part of growth, right? I mean, so all right, so I've got a couple other questions about that. So you said it yourself, you were a good player. You were never the starter for the most part. There was usually another, maybe even running back in the room that was a little bit better than you or more well-known than you. Mm-hmm. I'd love to talk about journeys of teams. I'm going to see if you can figure out the game and the scenario I was talking about, but I talk about this so much with athletes and teams, like you never know when you're going to make that impact. Or when you're going to make a difference, even if you're not the starter, or if your stats aren't incredible that day or that month or that year. And the 94 season, for people that don't remember, that was Coach Osborne's and yours first national championship. It was eventually won in the Orange Bowl against Miami. There were injuries that year to Tommy Frazier, the quarterback. There were injuries to Brooke Behringer, the quarterback, at times. You had Matt Derman quarterbacking at times. There was a game early in the preseason that was tighter than people expected. And there was a game-changing play that took place late in that game that involved you. Do you remember the game at all?
I do, actually.
And your role.
Wyoming, maybe?
The Wyoming game. Tell me what you remember about
that. Now that's a blast from the past. Yeah, yes. Wyoming. Oh, that's funny you bring that up. We were trailing at the half to a not a very good football team. And you know what's funny?
Remember, we won the national championship this year. So that's why this is really cool, right? We're losing to a team that we fully expected to win, and we're in trouble in that game. So go forward.
And I've never even told this backstory. So my favorite run in that game was so inconsequential and innocuous. It was unbelievable. So it'll tie something together for you, because I'll get to the key play that I think where my coaches finally started to believe in me, because I wasn't even playing running back. I had a run earlier in the game, like second quarter, something like that. It was a 42 counter sweep. It was to the right, and it was right in front of our bench. And I broke a couple of tackles, and I felt like it was one of my better runs. I put a hand in the ground. It was a reflection of a Coach Solich drill that I really pride myself in, even to this day. And I remember I came out of the game a couple of plays later, because Lawrence was feeling good again. I'd given him a break, and I remember thinking in my head, I was like, see, that's why you should be playing me. Did you, that run right there? Like, this is what I'm thinking in my head. Meanwhile, we're getting beat. And we're kind of scrambling at the half and we're a little disjointed. And they talked about coming together to make plays. And Coach Osborne is talking in the locker room. He said, hey, roles are different. And, Brooke had to be a guy, and Brooke was hurt, and Brooke was already filling in, and Tommy was on the sidelines in an Apex jacket, almost emotionless, right? So we were missing a lot of our leadership. And they said something at the half where you're going to have an unexpected role and you got to do something different. And when you're in situations like this, whatever's in you is going to come out. Like, what are we made of? He kept saying, what are you made of? And lo and behold, we punted the ball to Wyoming. They had a chance for a key drive to come back late in the game, and there was a fumble. And I remember recovering the fumble because I was playing special teams. And Doc, I got to tell you, it's funny you bring that up. I didn't even want to be on the defensive special teams because I wanted the ball. So I loved punt return and I love kick returns, right? I did that. But I fought tooth and nail over being on that doggone punt team. Right? I didn't want to cover punts. Mm-hmm. And we ended up we scored on that drive late. It was a short field. It kind of sealed the game. And I remember Coach Gill telling me that he said, nothing to it the way you do it, 2-1. And he just had this cadence and this deep voice. And I finally felt like, somebody recognized me doing something that I ordinarily wouldn't do, that I didn't even want to do. Right. Like that was crazy because we played so poorly in that game that you go back, but it was a key game. We needed to have that one. We didn't play well. That whole 94 season, Doc, was interesting because there are a lot of games we didn't hit on all cylinders. We did whatever we had to do to get by, and we won ugly quite a bit.
Yeah. So I'm glad you remembered, but I had read about that play, and I always say, like, every team has a journey and a backstory. And if we don't win that game, the rest of the story of that year doesn't happen anyway. Like, you don't beat Miami in Miami to win a title. And maybe that fumble recovery was the difference right there, right? We don't know. And so I'm always challenging athletes to accept the role they have, right? Embrace that role. Never know when you're, like the coach said at halftime, you don't know when you're going to make a difference or a play in this game, but you got to be open to it. And then in the moment, you might not realize the power of it, but in reflection, you're like, that was one play out of many that year that could have been the difference between winning it all and not winning it all. And it turned out to be in a role you didn't even want. It didn't even turn out to be your normal role or your main role on the team. And yet it might have been the play that made the biggest impact in your contribution to the team winning a national championship that year.
You know what's really interesting about that? I'll take it one step further to let you know you're on the right track. When they said at the half, the coaches are talking, hey, whatever's in you, what's in you? What's in you? We need something different. I've kind of birthed that into something different in my latter years. I call it the egg principle, but it all stems from that locker room talk where whatever's in you when you get squeezed is what comes out, right? When you break an egg, like whatever's in there, that's what's coming out. And I always go back to that when I need to function in high leverage situations, right? Because you have to challenge yourself. Hey, who are you? Who am I? And what am I going to do when, it gets hectic, right? I mean, I've had some dark days where I didn't feel like fighting and I kind of felt like a failure. And, what's the parenting plan going to be in my divorce? And will my kids still love me? And I just remember my dad telling me, who are you? Who are you? Do you know the power in your God-given name? And I just, I'm telling you, Doc, like it was a key catalyst to help kind of let the eggs settle, if you will, for lack of a better example.
Right. So this is a perfect time for me to read you this quote. You'll know what it means, but tell our audience what it means to you as it relates to an important person in your life. If you think you're beaten, you are. If you think You dare not, you don't.
Mm.
If you'd like to win, but think you can't, it's almost a cinch you won't. Life's battles don't always go to the stronger or faster man, but sooner or later, the man who wins is the one who thinks he can.
Yeah. Yeah. You're going to do it to me, Doc.
What is that?
That is one of the greatest lessons that my dad ever taught me.
Okay.
It is the power of the mind. And yeah. I mean, just the ability to take ownership of the one thing that you can control, and that's what you think. And just the different ways that he would put it and what he would regurgitate, um, it matters. It definitely matters.
Yeah. What else, as you reflect back on Dad, right? I mean, besides the power of the mind, I mean, what else are the one or two maybe key themes or messages that you take with you every day today as a man, as a parent, as a coach that helps you be the best version of yourself?
Yeah, there's two. He would always tell me, well, there's three actually. He'd say, people will tell you 90% of what you need to know if you just listen. Because he always wanted me to slow down. Hey, you don't know everything. Slow down and listen. So I've learned to be a better listener. Number two, which helps me with my interviews, right? I mean, I don't script questions, but I figure out what to ask just because I try to listen to what's being said. And then the other two things are, he'd say, if I ever found myself being too comfortable, I better move. And the only thing that grows under still feet is dead grass. Uh, those are things that are like just etched in my brain. I don't know if it's caused me to be more paranoid than competitive, but they have definitely been catalysts to move. I remember one time, Doc, I was struggling. It was in December, and was going through my divorce, and it was going to be the first Christmas Eve. We had to split, even though we were neighbors, we had to split. And so I'm at home by myself on Christmas Eve with Mike and Caleb at my ex-wife's, and I sat there for a while, and I had an Acura TL at the time, and I thought about, gosh, man, tonight would be a great night to see how fast I can get that thing to go, right? Like, what else do I have? And so, I took a shower and I got dressed, and I was just going to see what was open. Right? It's Christmas Eve. I don't have a ton to do. And one of my buddies called me, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come over and watch?" There was some bowl game being played in Hawaii. He says, "Why don't you come over and hang out with us?" I said, "No, I don't feel like being around company." And he's like, "Hey, just, come be with, our family." I was coaching his kids at the time. And he said, "Just come hang out." And I said, "No." I told him I'd call him back. And I walked down into the kitchen, and I was going to pour a drink. And I opened the fridge, and at this time, this was the first time that my dad had been diagnosed with aphasia, which it's a neurological, it's a degenerative deal where he's got some pressure on his frontal lobe. It acts a lot like Alzheimer's, and it's extremely aggressive. And sure as I'm sitting here, Doc, I thought to myself, who am I? What am I? And what would he think? And it was like autocorrect. I ended up going over to my to my buddy's house, Tyler Piper, and we had some good, long, deep talks about what was going right, what I could invest in, how to recalibrate the impact that I was still having on young people, because like I said, I was coaching at the time. And I go back to some of those times where who am I and what's in the name? And it's a quick reminder for me sometimes when I need to recalibrate, or I start to think things are a little worse than they are, because for as smart as some think I am, my mind is there are plenty of times I'd like to shut it down. Right, like I can be a little too analytical. So those good solid reminders, man, are they keep me going.
Yeah, they're just good resets, aren't they? It just changes what you really does. It changes your negative self-talk into positive
Yeah.
self-talk.
Yeah.
Right. And you just mentioned the power of the mind. And I know that's important to you because I hear how you talk to players and the importance that you ascribe to mindset. So I'm not sure how, whether we'll talk about this or a little or a lot, I'm not sure where to go with this, but I am curious just to see your initial comments, and we'll maybe talk not much about it at all. But you mentioned already a couple times, you mentioned Lawrence Phillips being
Yeah.
a friend of yours. You set up the GoFundMe account. For people that aren't as familiar, I mean, Lawrence Phillips was a star linebacker or a running back at Nebraska who had some real challenges here and got in some real trouble. And eventually life got caught up with him and he ended up dying in prison. And human beings are complicated, right? We know that it's never all good or all bad. But what lessons or what messages, if any, do you want to share about maybe what the life of Lawrence Phillips has taught you?
Well, there's a couple. Number one, it's meeting people right where they're at. I feel like I kind of learned this in teachers college, and I'm a special ed major, and I'm certified. My certification has since lapsed, but I was certified to teach K-8 mild to moderate behavior disorders. And one of the things that I remember they would always talk about and stress is kind of this blank slate theory, where students that come in your classroom operate with a blank slate, right? Where the canvas is pretty neat, and you let the students paint their own pictures without any preconceived notions. And for me, that typified Lawrence, where there was so much in there that was joyful and smart and loyal, almost to a fault, and loving, right? He loved hard, but he could dislike equally as hard. And to get inside, meeting him right where he was at was I think a gift. He taught me so much about competing in life, and having values placed on relationships as opposed to things. People used to always tell me, well, because he was my roommate on the road, and we spent so much time together. He basically took my job in California against UCLA in 93. I wasn't playing well. I'd put the ball on the carpet twice, lost one. My quarterback, Tommy Frazier at the time, walked me over to Coach Osborne, and he said, "This guy's not ready to play. Get him out of here." And Coach Osborne said to me in super calm voice, he said, "Hey, listen, since you didn't bother getting off the bus, why don't you be a spectator with the rest of us?" And in comes Lawrence, and he's in his hometown. He's from West Covina, and we win an ugly game against UCLA, and a star is born. But so was our relationship, because he was a guy that put his arm around me. He loved on me, told me he appreciated me, that I was going to need him, that it was a team thing. And those are things that I think for him at the time, coming out of the boys' home, and having to be in that group mentality and establish camaraderie, were one of those lessons that I learned early, because I never had up to that point learned to cheer for somebody to do well when it could have been at my expense. And this time it was at my expense. And so to learn to root him on, and to become really good friends with him was part of the growing, maturing phase for me, where you learn to cheer for teammates if you have a common vision, even though their success may be at your expense. And maybe that was part of the whole captain's thing later on, a couple of years later, where I'm fighting for a starting position with Amon and D'Angelo, and I'm coming off the great spring, and I feel like I should win a job, and not having that deter me when I didn't. I go back to those lessons about him putting his arm around me walking back to the bus. The Rose Bowl, it's funny what you remember. People that have been there know that it's a terrible stadium to get in and out of. And, the media is there, and, we were supposed to play really well, and it was a struggle. And I'm watching all the interviews happen. And again, it was at my expense. Did not prepare well going in. I had the big game earlier against Texas Tech, and I don't even remember preparation that week, which is another lesson learned about staying in the moment and not maxing out when I should have maxed out, because I was nowhere near the best version of myself heading into Los Angeles. But just the things that he taught me about what it means to establish relationships and how important relationships were to him. Now, it manifested itself in different ways with him as we'd come to know, but when he trusted you and he was all in, he was great. So the ability to cheer for one another. And the other thing was, he fought life hard, and for as tough a hand as he was dealt sometimes, some of it was his own doing, I get it, but he never complained. He just didn't complain. He was a low maintenance teammate. He practiced in the bare minimum. He traveled with the bare minimum. He just required a little bit of nourishment, a little bit of a workout regimen, and a lot of sleep, right? He just wasn't a high maintenance guy. Didn't need a lot of stuff. He didn't value money. And I admired that about him. And people used to always talk to me about, well, does he know that he's doing this and they're wasting this? And I said, listen, your perspective is the same. Everybody has different tools in their toolbox. And for him, the monetary portion of how to put a house together just is not in his toolbox. If he can stretch $20, he's not worried about $200,000. I mean, you're speaking Portuguese, and I'll always admire that about him. And unless you had the opportunity to spend an inordinate amount of time with him, those are some things that you would never know about him. But he loved hard, and I'll never forget that.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that about him, because it's a sensitive topic in some ways, and yet, human beings are complex, and things happen in situations. And I think it's a great lesson in a lot of ways, that the structure and support that we have in our lives, sometimes we don't have it at different times in our lives, and some people need it. And certainly when that structure and support changed for him, I think it probably brought out the things that he wasn't as good at and led him down a path that probably wouldn't have happened had he continued to have that same structure and support system. But man, you can learn great lessons from people, even though they had struggle and didn't
no
have
question
conclusion of their life the way most people would have hoped for him or for himself. And but yet there were still some really, really cool things about him, like you said, that a lot of people could learn from. So, I mean, you've learned from lots of people during this time. I mean, your first 20 some years is filled with struggle, with achievement, with learning, and still went along the way. But all that has led to this next period of time of growth for you in a lot of different areas. Talk to me about this life experience we've had. How has it shaped you as a coach? Because a coach is part of who you are.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, it's a big part of who you are, whether you're coaching your kids as a parent, but I mean, just coaching kids. You had a great career coaching some of the great high school teams in Omaha North, a few years back under Larry Martin. And then obviously just as of late, you've had a chance to coach at Westside, but you had a lot of years coaching some of the finest teams in history of the state of Nebraska. But more about your coaching. How did you become a better coach based on your life experiences leading up to that point?
So I think first and foremost, it's meeting people right where they're at.
Mhm.
Right. I'm an elementary education major. Quick sidebar. This just shows you how out of touch I am with reality. When it came time to pick a major at Nebraska, I was telling him about Dennis LeBlanc and him calling me an underachiever. You know what the major that I wanted to do was I wanted to be a marine biologist. And I about got laughed out of his office. He said, you realize we're a landlocked state and we don't offer that as a degree. And I'm like, wow, like you talk about being clueless. But so he asked me, he said, well, what else do you love? And I was like, I love kids. All right. Like I I like young people. He said, how about education? I said, oh, no. My dad does that. That's too close to home. And I thought about it for a second. And I said, well, I could coach. That'd be cool. And the rest is history. Now, how that manifests itself today, the toughest year that I had was the first year of the pandemic without coaching. And I realized that for all the stuff that I do for other people and vice versa, they do for me, the thing that fills my bucket, kind of my sweet spot, I think is being able to invest in young people. And without the ability to do that, it was a very difficult year, right? I'm on the heels of, I was coaching at Omaha North, and Caleb had every opportunity to come to Omaha North, and kind of at the 11th hour, decided that he wanted to go to Westside. He's big on the modular scheduling, kind of the two-sport thing, what it presented. He wanted to do something different. In hindsight, I think it was kind of to get away from me. Maybe didn't turn out to be that way because, I asked him before I accepted the position that Coach Freund had offered me, because he asked me for 2 years in a row to come coach at Westside. And the first year I said no. I didn't want to be the guy that followed my kiddo, and I just wanted to give it some time. And I started to watch the culture, the impact that guys like yourself, Dr. Moravec, the kind of man Coach Frank was. I said, oh, this is a lot different than I thought. This is a lot of what I'm used to. Other-centered, being able to say the word love out loud, correcting folks with love, meeting people right where you're at. The demographics look vastly different than I thought it would look from the outside looking in. I was a big Dr. Lucas guy because I had met him from his time at York. During the radio show, we had adopted teams that were playing in the state finals, and we adopted York on kind of a short straw. And he would email the show and say he'd appreciate the support. And he sent me York Duke's gear and the Iron Tough training t-shirts. And, he was a guy, coincidentally, Doc, how about this? You're getting the whole tell-all. I suggested him to be the new superintendent of Omaha Public Schools. I said, hey, I got a guy. And, short story long, I don't know if they thought he was from a diverse enough school district or a big enough school district, whatever. But he ended up becoming a superintendent at Westside, and just picking his brain and kind of seeing his vision made Caleb's decision a lot easier. But from that, I knew I want to be around young people. I love athletics. I love competing. I want to be able to instill some life toughness, how to stay ahead of the game, how to teach people to be young men. It just was really important to me. And if you'd asked me in 2005, when I took my first assistant coaching job with Coach Lamanji at Omaha Burke, I wouldn't have told you that. He kind of had to talk me into it. He asked me 3 or 4 times to join his staff. I was doing football broadcasting for Cox, and I had never coached before at the high school level, and it wasn't something I was interested in. But it was the relationship and the trust that I had in him and how passionate he was about young men. He was a Youngstown guy, and it was about, he's like, it's bigger than the game of football. And I used to think, like, what's bigger than the game of football? Like, this is about football, right? This is how I'm thinking. I mean, however old I am, I'm 30, and I'm just done playing, and I'm fresh off the indoor league and playing arena. And I just realized meeting kids right where they're at and watching them grow is a huge part of who I am, and being able to cheer kids on. And I love meeting kids right where they're at. I want to know your story. Like, how can we make this work where you let me in, where I can learn from you, and be inspired, and you can maybe learn from me, and have it be a mutual thing, right? I am uniquely connected, I think, to young people just by how much I think they're capable of. It totally matters.
Oh, and I love that a lot. So, all right. So, I mean, this last hour or so we've spent talking about a lot of areas where you've struggled and grown. And you also mentioned, the scrambled egg philosophy. Where are you right now at this moment in time in terms of how close are you to being the full scrambled eggs? And what else do you see in the weeks, months, and years ahead that you can still do to, if you're already the scrambled eggs, to even be a better version of them? And if not, how do we get there?
Yeah, how do I enhance the recipe? Well, there's a couple things, I want to continue to be able to lead in my own household, be the husband that I've been called to be the father that I've been called to be. I've got, 2 boys, 2 girls. Zoe's gonna be 4 here in June, Doc. I want to model the behavior that I think, that she can take with her. I missed some of the early opportunities with my oldest daughter, while I was trying to figure out who I was, that keep me motivated, where reinvesting and making sure that those kinds of things don't happen again. I embrace it. I think pressure is a privilege, and I've put a fair amount on myself. I know people say, well, pressure is something that you put on yourself, and I absolutely believe that, but I also don't think pressure is a negative either. And so I embrace the challenge to have a meaningful impact in her life. And I want to continue to coach. It was the one thing that, with all the job opportunities that come out, whether it's, it's Big Ten or whatever, full time, or to do something someplace else, or in the media, coaching is an integral part of something that is a non-negotiable. I've just figured out that I'm better around young people than not. And it's an area that I want to continue to grow in and see where it leads.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty exciting, right? To be able to invest in young people along the way through your own growth path, and to be able to double down, like you said, and do things a little bit better than you've had when you look back and go, I wasn't completely secure in my place, so I couldn't be the best version. Because you mentioned modeling behaviors. Obviously, I'm just this big believer, as whether we're a coach or a parent or a leader, that we can never ask people to do things if we can't show them and model that behavior. Like, how can we expect those that we lead to be calm or to be positive or to communicate well if we can't show them how to do it?
Stuff to give what you've never received, right?
Right. And it's a growth path, right? And then that last piece, I think you said that, of course, what I think of pressure as a privilege, and showing that Doc Rivers video too, where he talks about
that's fantastic.
But I always say that pressure is a privilege as long as we've trained confidence. Because if we've trained confidence, we can deal with pressure and nerves. It's when the worry and the doubt, the lack of preparation, the cheating the process, some of those things that you've talked about, either that you've observed in others or even in yourself on occasion, that when we start to feel that pressure, it becomes a negative because we know we didn't prepare. We didn't fully invest in the process. We weren't ready. And when we're not ready and things aren't going well and the moment's big, now we get nervous and anxious. And now the pressure is no longer a privilege versus, look, I put in the work. This is a big day. I can't wait to show off myself and my team to the world, or whatever I'm doing right now, whether it's a big radio show, whether it's a really important conversation you have with one of your kids, because we have challenging ones, obviously, with our kids at
Oh, yeah.
times, or our wives or significant others, that the pressure can turn into a privilege if we have the foundation. And so we say it always starts with those controllables of attitude, effort, energy, and preparation. So to be honest with you, Coach, I mean, this is maybe even exceeded what I had hoped. Because I spent a lot of time listening to you, I just felt like you have this ability or willingness, right? A lot of people have the abilities to, but the willingness to go places that we don't even know we're going to go sometimes. But then when the moment is right, or the question is right, or the time is right, you'll go there. And obviously you went there on more than one occasion today. It didn't surprise me because you've had to take on lots of challenging conversations on the air about topics of society and politics, and and with team, with coaches and with athletes and in your family life, and even as far back as to say, I'm not black enough for some and too black for others. This period where there's a lot of challenges and we have to figure out how to navigate them. And I don't know, you seem to attack those head on. So I was hopeful that would happen today. You've exceeded my expectations in some of the areas that we covered. Is there anything else as we are wrapping up that you wanted to share that I didn't ask you about, or that you wanted to comment on?
Well, I think sometimes I think a lot of what you bring to the table, because a lot of the ability to do those things that I don't expect, it centers around a couple of things. Number one, I think you have my best interests at heart. And so I think if people spend some time really with some self-awareness and kind of seeing who they surround themselves with, you're capable of great things, right? If you don't ask the right questions and you haven't built the kind of rapport, or at least exude the type of integrity that I think you do from afar, you're probably not getting this stuff out of me, right? So I think your ability to be authentic and kind of who you really are helps. So I would suggest gravitating towards that for those that are listening. And the other thing is, you cannot be afraid at any point to have to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me, or my fault, right? Because I'm going to tell you, for as much as you think it may hurt, there's something freeing in being able to say that out loud. And I just think the ability to do that, it takes the burden off of feeling that you need to be perfect, which is often when people are paralyzed, as opposed to just maximizing that they can cross that bridge. Yeah. That's as simple as a complicated way I could put it.
what a great message as we're kind of wrapping things up. But I think it also, what you're really saying, I think, and I'm not putting words in for you, but in general for people, when they look back on a lot of things, so many times you'd say to yourself, I'll bet they wish that they could have done that over, or I wish that life had been different during that time. And so often people tell me, no, I wouldn't want to change a thing because it's allowed me to become who I am. Now, there's certain tough things that happen in life. Of course, you'd want a do-over, but so often where we get our biggest growth is through adversity and through failure. And so often people say, you think that I would have wanted that to be different, but in fact, as I reflect now, I'm glad it didn't happen that way, because that's where my growth took place. And so I think that's kind of what you're saying in general too, which is, look, life happens, you learn from it, you grow, you go backwards a little bit, you grow some more. And as long as you're okay with acknowledging it and not expecting perfection as the outcome, and allowing yourself to forgive yourself when, yeah, we go backwards a little bit, we say the wrong things, we act the wrong way. um, it gives us permission to move forward and heal and then do things better. And so I think you've
That's
explained.
the key. I like how, yeah, I may have to borrow that. I like that.
Yeah. Well, Damon, I cannot tell you how happy I am that you took the chance to come on this with me, because you're a pretty popular figure in the area. You do a lot of things for a lot of people, and sometimes it's nice to have people hear sort of your story, because you're usually the one asking the questions.
Yeah.
You're usually the one getting the story out of other people. And I think it's cool when people can see why you're able to ask the questions you do, and why you're able to share things sometimes that people would say, well, I don't know if I would have the courage to share that myself. But
Yeah.
we've heard your backstory, we've heard some of your struggles, we've heard your mentors, the modeling of behavior you've had over your life, and this final acknowledgement of, I think, where we're starting to feel worthy about ourselves. And that's when it gets pretty cool, because you've earned that. And
I'm in a good place, Doc. I appreciate you.
yeah, thank you so much for being on the Max Out Mindset podcast.
Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it.